Over the past 5 weeks, we have opened 5 files. 5 women, 5 lives. 5 stories that history buried under the name of the man who took them. We told you about Polly, the mother of 5 who needed 4pence for a bed and never made it home. We told you about Annie, who had already buried 1 child before Whitechapel found her. We told you about Elizabeth, the Swedish farmer's daughter, who crossed an ocean and was still singing in a kitchen on her last evening alive. We told you about Catherine, who gave a false name at a police station at 1 a.m. and turned left toward Mitre Square. And we told you about Mary Jane, the youngest, who was heard singing Irish songs in a candlelit room hours before someone took everything from her. 5 women, 5 episodes, and one question that this series has been building toward since the very beginning. Does the mystery of who Jack the Ripper was matter more than the lives that were lost? This is CrimeArchive, and tonight we close the file on the Women of Whitechapel. When you look at the 5 women together, not as victims, not as case numbers, but as people, certain things become clear that the individual episodes could only hint at. All 5 were living in extreme poverty, not the poverty of inconvenience or temporary hardship, the poverty of having no safety net whatsoever, no savings, no family support close enough to help, no system designed to catch them. All 5 were middle-aged or approaching it, with the exception of Mary Jane Kelly. They were not young women at the beginning of their lives. They were women in their 40s who had already lived through marriages, children, separations, bereavements, and decades of struggle before Whitechapel became their world. All 5 had once had something more. Polly had a husband and 5 children. Annie had a home in Windsor. Elizabeth had a coffee shop. Catherine had walked the roads of England selling ballads. Mary Jane had a room of her own. Every single one of them had been failed, not by their own choices alone, but by a system that offered women in their situation almost nothing to hold on to. And all 5 died in the same narrow geography, within half a mile of each other, in a district that the city around it had largely decided to ignore. That is not coincidence. That is the context the killer operated in. Scotland Yard's investigation into the Whitechapel murders of 1888 was, by the standards of its time, substantial. Hundreds of officers were deployed, thousands of interviews were conducted, plainclothes detectives patrolled the streets, bloodhounds were brought in, the press was engaged, the public was asked for information. And yet the killer was never identified. Why? The honest answer is that the investigation failed these women for the same reasons that society had already failed them. The victims were poor. They were women. They were living outside the respectable structures that Victorian England valued and protected. Their movements were irregular. Their social connections were fragile. The witnesses in their world were people who had every reason to be cautious about talking to police. The geography of Whitechapel, its maze of alleys, its density of lodging houses, its constant movement of people at all hours, made surveillance almost impossible. And the forensic tools that would make such a case solvable today simply did not exist. No fingerprints, no DNA, no CCTV, no digital records, no forensic database. The killer had chosen his victims and his territory with a precision, whether conscious or instinctive, that made him almost impossible to catch with the tools available in 1888. Here is something that rarely gets discussed in the avalanche of Jack the Ripper content that has been produced over the past 130 years. The investigation was also compromised by the media. The letters, the nickname, the sensational coverage, the competing theories printed daily in newspapers desperate for readers. All of it created noise that made the signal harder to find. Officers were chasing hoaxes. The public were reporting sightings of people matching descriptions that had been printed in the papers rather than based on anything they had actually seen. And the name Jack the Ripper, which was almost certainly invented by a journalist or a hoaxer rather than the killer himself, gave the murderer a mythology that made him simultaneously more famous and less catchable. The media didn't solve the case. The media made it harder to solve. More than 100 suspects have been proposed for the Jack the Ripper murders over the past 130 years. Some are credible, most are not. All of them share the same fundamental problem: not enough evidence. The three names that appear most consistently in serious historical research are Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant and barber living in Whitechapel at the time of the murders, named by at least one senior police officer as the most likely suspect. In 2014, a DNA analysis claimed to link him to a shawl found at Catherine Eddowes' murder scene. The analysis was contested by other scientists and has never been officially confirmed. Montague John Druitt, a barrister and school teacher who drowned in the Thames in December 1888, weeks after the final murder. Another senior police officer believed him to be the most likely suspect. His body was found shortly after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. Whether that timing is significant or coincidental has never been established. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was arrested in London in November 1888 on an unrelated charge and fled to America before he could be further questioned. He was described by a senior Scotland Yard officer as a suspect. He was never charged with anything connected to the murders. Each of these men had circumstances that made investigators suspicious. None of them were ever charged. None of them were ever proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. And the case has never been officially closed. In 2019, a documentary claimed to have finally identified Jack the Ripper using new forensic evidence. The claim generated international headlines. Within weeks, forensic experts had identified significant problems with the methodology. It was not the first time a documentary or a book had claimed to solve the case. It will not be the last. And this pattern of confident claims, followed by expert challenges, followed by the case remaining exactly as open as it was before, has repeated itself so many times over 130 years that it has become its own kind of story. The mystery of Jack the Ripper has an almost gravitational pull on human curiosity. People are drawn to it. People want to solve it. People want the satisfaction of a closed file. But the file has not closed. And every time someone claims it has, look carefully at the evidence before you believe them. From the very first episode of the Women of Whitechapel, this series has been asking a question that most Jack the Ripper content never asks. Does the mystery matter more than the lives? Because here is what 130 years of Ripper obsession has produced. Thousands of books, hundreds of documentaries, countless theories, walking tours, museum exhibitions, film adaptations, an entire industry built around the question of who he was. And in the middle of all of it, 5 women whose names most people cannot recall without prompting. Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane. While the killer's nickname has become one of the most recognizable in criminal history, recognized instantly in countries that had no connection to Victorian London, the women he killed have remained footnotes. Footnotes in their own story. Here is the most uncomfortable truth about the Jack the Ripper case. The reason the mystery has survived for 130 years is not purely because the killer was never caught. It is because the victims were the kind of women that Victorian society, and much of the culture that followed it, found easy to overlook. If 5 women from wealthy families had been murdered in Mayfair in 1888, the investigation would have been different. The resources would have been different. The press coverage would have been different. And the cultural legacy would have been very different. The Jack the Ripper mystery endures in part because the conditions that made the murders possible, poverty, inequality, the invisibility of vulnerable women, made the case harder to solve and easier to mythologize. The killer was never caught, but the world that allowed him to operate the way he did, that is something we can name. 5 weeks ago, we opened the first file. We told you about a woman who needed 4 pence for a bed and never made it home. We promised that this series would remember the people, not just the mystery. We have tried to keep that promise. Polly Nichols was not the first victim. She was a mother of 5 who had written hopeful letters about fresh starts. Annie Chapman was not the second victim. She was a woman who had buried 1 child and cared for another through the collapse of everything around her. Elizabeth Stride was not the third victim. She was a Swedish farmer's daughter who crossed an ocean because she believed the world was bigger than the life she had been born into. Catherine Eddowes was not the 4th victim. She was a woman who walked the roads of England, selling ballads, and made people laugh in the hardest of circumstances. Mary Jane Kelly was not the 5th victim. She was the youngest. She sang Irish songs in a candlelit room on the last night of her life. 5 women, 5 lives, 5 stories that deserve to be told on their own terms. The file on Jack the Ripper remains open, but the files on these 5 women, they're real files, the ones that record who they actually were before history reduced them to a number. Those files we have tried to open. Their names were Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Remember them. If the Women of Whitechapel series has moved you, if you have learned something about these 5 women that you didn't know before, comment the word mysteries below. And if CrimeArchive is the kind of channel that pulls you in, cold cases, forgotten victims, and questions that history still cannot answer, subscribe. Because the Women of Whitechapel file is now closed, but the archive is full of files that aren't. CrimeArchive. Some files never close.